we're just going to move on with the show. We're going to move to another issue that is NATO and many things surrounding it. And for this conversation, we are very honored to be joined once again by Dr. Vijay Prashad, who is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute. Vijay, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Well, a pleasure to have you here as always. And, it's interesting because, of course, President Donald Trump made worldwide news by saying that if he was president again, he would encourage Russia to, do whatever the hell they wanted to any NATO member that did not, spend enough money on their military, according to Trump. But the bigger question here, Vijay, that a lot of people are talking about and the freak out that's happening in D.C. is he's questioning NATO, he's questioning our alliances. And I guess it just begs the question, do we really need NATO? Even if the messenger isn't right, is this a conversation we need to start having?
Well, it's firstly great to be with you guys again. I think Trump's comments are completely being misread. Trump didn't say that NATO is unnecessary. This is not an attack by Trump on NATO. I think there's a way when Trump speaks, people just read whatever they want into his statements. In fact, what Trump is saying is something worse than close down NATO. What Trump is saying is he's saying that European countries need to spend more in their defense. There was an agreement reached a few years ago that European countries would spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. Trump, even when he was president last time, traveled around the European continent, met with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, and pretty bluntly said, if you guys don't spend 2%, we're not defending you. He's just repeating the same thing. He's trying to get the Europeans to put more money into defense. This is not actually an attack on NATO. It's an attempt to get European countries to spend more on defense. Take the case of Germany. Germany has a serious problem. After the conflict began 2 years ago in Ukraine, after Russian troops entered Ukraine, Germany passed an emergency fund which allowed them to lift their military spending so that they could send Leopard tanks to Ukraine, send other heavy artillery into Ukraine, and so on. They essentially donated it to the Ukrainian forces. So they plugged the hole by putting in this emergency fund. This emergency fund is going to run out. Germany has a problem. They have what is known as the debt brake. So they can't actually go into debt to finance government spending. They also don't have the appetite, despite the fact that it's a so-called social democratic-led government. They don't have the appetite to raise taxes. So if they're going to maintain 2% military spending, they're going to have to slash welfare payments. They're going to have to slash social wages. They're going to have to slash, the democratic spending that they have in their society. All of that is going to have to be cut. What Trump is basically saying to Olaf Scholz, who is a pretty mild, milquetoast kind of leader of the German state, what he's saying to people like Scholz is, buck up. You're going to have to slash spending for the people. You're going to increase austerity because you have to move more money to the military side of things. That's what Trump is saying. This is not an attack on NATO. In fact, as I said, it's worse than that. It's trying to strengthen European military defense, which would in turn strengthen NATO. NATO is an obsolete military alliance that is, in fact, trying to raise the temperature, not only along the flank of the border between what used to be called Western Europe and Eastern Europe, particularly with Russia, but also NATO is involved in itself in the destruction of Libya. That's not in Europe. That's on the African continent. NATO has involved itself in the occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years. There is now talk of an Asian NATO to challenge. It is effectively a war-making, destructive machine that needs to be shut down. But let's not misunderstand anything. Mr. Trump is not saying close down NATO. In fact, Mr. Trump is saying put more money into European defense. That's even worse. And I don't understand how anybody can listen to Trump and say, well, he's saying get rid of NATO. Is that a good thing? Certainly not what he's saying.
Oh, you're muted, Rania.
Of course I'm muted, because why not? Um, it sounds to me, VJ, like what you're trying to say is that NATO is a humanitarian organization that should continue to be supported by all of the civilized countries. No, I mean, it's when you look at the record of NATO, there's no denying that it has done nothing but destroy, destroy, destroy. I've had you come on Dispatches a few times and talk about NATO in the context of both the, you shed some light on NATO in Africa, which I don't think people are familiar with the NATO's role in Africa. You should go watch that episode if you're not, as well as NATO's role in the new Cold War, not just with Russia, but also with China, like the expansion of NATO to include China. And so it seems to me that this, this reaction to Donald Trump, we saw it a lot when Donald Trump was president. Everybody would cry about it, about, oh my God, he wants to defund NATO. Oh my God, he doesn't want to be with our allies, even though he kind of just continued, everything as usual. But I guess the question becomes beyond Ukraine, because a lot of people only understand NATO now in the context of Ukraine. But there's so much more destructive capacity for this organization. It really is an organization, a military cooperation of the imperialist countries. So what should people be concerned about with NATO beyond Ukraine?
See, NATO was created in 1949. The express purpose was the so-called defense of Europe. In fact, it was a platform that allowed US power to maintain its authority in formerly independent European countries, so that US bases in Germany and in Italy, bases set up basically in the aftermath of World War II, could have a permanence there. In fact, there are still US bases in Germany and Italy. NATO effectively became the instrument of the permanent military establishment by the United States on the European continent. That's what NATO was. Well, NATO was not alone. In the 1950s, the United States created the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, the so-called Manila Pact. They created the Central Treaty Organization, the so-called Baghdad Pact. Well, these pacts have disappeared. There's no more SEATO. There's no more CENTO. So NATO, this parochial organization supposedly set up to defend Europe, has now taken on this role of global NATO. In the absence of a CENTO, in the absence of SEATO, NATO intellectuals of NATO like Ivo Dalder and others have 20 years ago started talking about the role of global NATO having a global footprint. Now, again, some of this is a little disingenuous, for somebody like Ivo Dalde to write and say there needs to be global NATO. Just a second. There's always been a kind of global NATO. United States has bases in Japan, has bases in Philippines, has bases in Southeast Asia, bases all over the world. And because the United States effectively runs NATO command, it has access to the intelligence of the NATO countries, what was called the Five Eyes Intelligence Network. Now the 14 Eyes Intelligence Network includes basically all the NATO countries. If you put together US military spending, which is gargantuan, and you have to recognize that the Financial Times just a few weeks ago celebrated the rise in military spending, saying this is good for business. I mean, so vulgar at a time when there's a genocidal war against the Palestinians in Gaza, for the business press to say so openly and vulgarly that it's good that military spending is increasing is extraordinary. So, on the one side, the United States, through the Five Eyes, now 14 Eyes Intelligence Network, its military allies, we calculated the amount of military spending by these countries. 3/4 of global military spending is done by NATO countries, the NATO allies, including, say, South Korea, Japan, and so on. The United States, by far, in the lead of military spending, by far, but still through these allies. So there's always, in a sense, been a kind of global NATO. They want to formalize it. They talked about an Asian NATO. And I was very interested to listen to the Indian foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar. It's a right-wing government, a far right-wing government in India. Mr. Jaishankar was asked, would India join Asian NATO, or would India join NATO plus, a kind of the sort of children's table of NATO, which would include Japan and so on. And Mr. Jaishankar answered the interviewer saying, look, we are against the NATO mindset. I thought that was really interesting. We are against the NATO mindset. Well, let's back up, Rania. What's the NATO mindset? Effectively, and I think just trying to interpret what Mr. Jaishankar said, the NATO mindset is we have the right to use military force anywhere in the world at any point to do anything we want. By the way, that's a paraphrase of George W. Bush, used to be the president of the United States, who said after 9/11, we will attack anybody at any time, anywhere. And that's the NATO mindset. We will attack anybody, anytime, anywhere, including recklessly. We will challenge China. Now, China only has 12% of the world's share of military spending. It's effectively a defensive power. China is not going to come and assault the United States. There's going to be no attack on US shipping in the Pacific and so on. But China has the capacity to defend itself. So it's kind of madness, this NATO mindset. I think that's what Jaishankar was talking about. It is literally madness. And I don't want to be rude. I don't want to accuse Lloyd Austin of a bout of madness. But there is a madness in the NATO mindset. They want to weaken Russia. Russia is a major nuclear power. It's a major power in Eurasia. You can't weaken Russia. You can't weaken China. It's just not possible. I don't know what they're thinking. There is a madness in their thought process. And I found it interesting, by the way, in the middle of all this, that Mr. Putin, in fact, comes on the side of Biden this time, not Trump. So I'm sure that confuses all the Democrats who have a kind of allergic reaction to Donald Trump and say, well, now Putin has in fact endorsed Biden. What does this mean? Will they continue to want to weaken Russia? An impossible, dangerous, mad strategy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I also just want to note here in terms of military spending by various countries, the excellent new publication Hyper-Imperialism from Tricontinental lays this out very well in both word and great graphic representations. And, I always wonder about these things in terms of what the impact is going to be in some of these countries, that are pushing so, aggressively for the expansion of NATO. And I wonder if you are at all hopeful that things like, say, the emergence of the BSW party in Germany and others are a sign that in Europe itself, some people are saying this is madness and we have to go in another direction?
Well, I'm talking to you from Paris, France, and I've spent the last few days talking to various political forces. I must say, I'm not very confident that in Europe there will be a pushback. I think the forces of reason are extremely weak. This is France. This is Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron's attitude to immigrants. And I'm sorry, I'm going to say this pretty strongly because I think it's accurate, in fact. I'm not making a judgment on his character. I'm not throwing words about. But Mr. Macron's attitude towards immigration is not unlike the Vichy government attitude towards immigration during the Nazi occupation of France. The way that Mr. Macron, Ms. Meloni in Italy, the Spanish government have gone on the rampage for pension reform. They want to reform pension. That means reform pension. By the way, sounds mild. You want to reform pension. Sounds like, well, maybe it's a bad thing, needs to be reformed. But what they mean is lift the pension age. That means have people work longer before they start getting benefits. Well, you're going to lift the pension. You'll also lift military spending. That's their attitude. That's what Jaishankar, in a sense, meant by the NATO mindset. They are willing to sacrifice their own people in order to build this military alliance. The rise of new political forces in Germany and so on, we'll have to see. They haven't been tested yet. All we have right now are polling data, and polls are extremely inaccurate when it comes to countries like Germany and so on. The electorate is pretty fickle. They can go anywhere. The country with the highest military spending in Europe is Poland. Poland spends up to 3.9% of its GDP on the military. Appalling welfare policies by that government. Now, no longer a government of the far right, but appalling welfare policies. Part of the problem, Eugene, is in Europe, as in Britain and in North America, United States and Canada, the gap between the right and the, let's call them the neoliberals, on bulk of policy making, the gap between, say, Macron and Marine Le Pen is so narrow that it stops your heart. I sat in the German parliament and listened to the debate around NATO and in Ukraine. And it was striking. The Green Party and the Alliance for Deutschland sound the same, belligerent, nasty, arrogant about Germany's role in history. The Green Party and the Alliance for Deutschland, which is a near fascist party. Then you have the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats. They all sound the same. I mean, they have the same outlook. I'm not so confident that in the medium term, Europe is going to be able to turn things around. Tomorrow I go to Brussels. I'm going to have some events with the Workers' Party of Brussels. They are polling extremely well in that country. That's the country which is the headquarters of NATO. They are coming up to 15% in the polls. That's very significant in a country where most parties poll in that territory. That means they're up there with the major leagues. If the Workers' Party does well in the elections this year, they might put pressure on the various political forces in Belgium. And why are they doing so well? Because they are arguing against austerity. They are arguing against the rise of electricity prices. They have linked the ridiculous continuation of the war in Ukraine, now 2 years. They've linked that to the rise of bills in households, and they've built momentum. That's the kind of thing you need to see, a new kind of confidence, a new kind of clarity from forces of the people in Europe. And Europe has, for a long time, not had that. Delinquent in Germany was too scared to come out there and speak directly. I mean, look at European politics around the genocidal war in Gaza, the bombing and killing of the Palestinians. European political forces weak, unable to even criticize something so obviously as a genocidal war, which the International Court of Justice sits again right there in the Low Countries, said there's plausible evidence of genocide, and there's still silence from Macron, silence from Olaf Scholz. In fact, not silence. Olaf Scholz's government said there's no genocide, to which the Namibian government criticized them and so on. So I'm not confident the political situation in Europe. On the other hand, let's see what happens in the Belgian election. Because if the Workers' Party does well, it might increase the confidence of other forces to no longer be so careful, to be poll-driven, to focus test their morals. You can't build a political agenda at a time of multiple crises. You can't build a political agenda based on focus testing. You have to build it based on your understanding of the situation. And a lot of these parties have become effectively influenced by Blairism, Clintonism. Let's see what the polls say. Let's bring 10 people into a room and do some focus testing. Man, when you do that, you lost your soul. You have sold your soul to the devil.
Yeah, no, France even brought in presidential debates to be more like the United States. So we can see all those different pieces as always. Well, Vijay, we always appreciate you breaking down all these different pieces. Looking forward to your report from Brussels. Vijay Prashad, the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute. Thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot. Take care of yourself.